Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Live, the podcast where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job, and we help you level up so you become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter. And today, Juan is bringing the topic, and we're going to be talking about two very important objects in JavaScript. Juan, what are these two objects that we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about sets and maps. And the reason for this is because like people that are new to JavaScript, our audience here, our target audience, they don't know about like all these different things that exist that JavaScript offers that can make their lives easier when they are facing some problems, some programming problems, or maybe some interview questions. Sets and maps have become really popular in the past few years, like probably in the past 6 years since they were heavily introduced with ES 2015 or ES 6, right? Depending how you want to call it. But the things like they're very useful and they're very powerful because they can save you some time if you understand when to use them, where to use them, how to use them. So you don't have to fall back to like all alternatives like, oh, let's use just arrays for everything or objects for everything, when you end up writing a lot of boilerplate extra code. So it's just a time saver. So we're just gonna discuss about these some cases and it's gonna be fun, especially because bootcamp graduates don't know about sets and maps, and this is handy for interviews. This that can save you with an interview question. So maybe we'll have some examples about that too. So, Jared, let's just start with sets because sets is like the easiest start to start digesting everything else. But sets are really easy. So I'm just gonna start with a little like generic, not to JavaScript specific, but sets. Maybe you remember from your college classes or maybe from high school. Like set is something that is part of math theory, right? So set is not something that is just exclusive to JavaScript. But yeah, there's like a whole mathematical part of that. But today we're going to be talking specific about the JavaScript ones. But yeah, so for anybody out there listening and Googling this, make sure you Google about sets in JavaScript. The spell is SET. Okay, I will include maybe some links in the description on the YouTube, probably on the YouTube site or on Twitter. So yeah, so let's talk about sets in JavaScript. Jared, what is a set in JavaScript?
Yeah, so a set in JavaScript is most similar to an array in JavaScript, right? So, everyone at this point, if you've gone through a dev boot camp, has been familiar with what an array is, right? It's essentially a list of things, and we can add things to that list. We can remove things from that list. We can go through that list to try to find the item that we're looking for. Well, the special thing about a set that is distinct and separate from a list or an array is uniqueness, right? And again, this goes back to what Juan just said about, sets going back to, mathematical theorems and things like that, is that they are unique. So the idea is that when you go to add a new item to a set in JavaScript, behind the scenes, it's going to check to see if that item already is added. And if it is, it's not going to add it again. If it doesn't exist, then it will add that item. So Juan, why is this so useful in JavaScript?
Yeah. So summarizing like what you just said, like set, right, is a collection, just like an array, but of unique items, right? So we have the uniqueness, and this uniqueness, it's important because sometimes when we're implementing solutions for our real life problems, we just want certain items to be just counted just once. Maybe, for example, if we're doing transactions and maybe we just need to print a report out of the transaction, maybe we don't want to repeat multiple times if we're getting multiple transactions. For example, sets in real life. I like to start explaining with what is a set in real life, so then people start understanding. For example, in real life, when we are in the kitchen, right? We say like, hey, I'm just gonna buy a new set of knives, right? Or a kitchen set. Usually a kitchen set or a knife set, you see that you don't have repeated items. I mean, you don't get a kitchen set and everything is just cups, right? It's usually different items, right? Usually, especially with knives. Usually it's different knives. You don't have two knives of the same, because why would you like to have five knives of the same? It's not a set anymore, right? It's just like so that's like one example there. When it comes to real life, for example, with JavaScript, let's say we want to create, Jared, a playlist, right? So, okay, we're going to create a playlist, and the requirements is that you add the song, and the song to the playlist, maybe you have a collection, an array of all the songs you have available, right? And those are objects, metadata that represents each of the songs. like the track, the name, the title, the author, year, some information. So let's say we want to create a playlist. How would you go around creating a playlist? Actually, with a set, because then you can just have the items just once. Sets keep the order, right? Just as an array. So you can iterate them, and then it just keeps the unique item, the unique reference. So let's talk about that, Jared. So we have the uniqueness. So I gave some real life examples where we could use sets, right? And there's a lot of them. So pretty much anytime you think that, hey, I can just have each of the items just once. Let's say I just need to count the users just once, and maybe you have the users in multiple records because it's maybe post for a social network or something like that, and you just want to get a unique list for whatever reason. So sets are a good candidate. So Jared, let's talk about like the uniqueness, right? When it comes to JavaScript, like how do we know like something is unique? Because we know we have, for example, two objects that could be two different references. So what happens in that case? Or what happens with primitive? Let's talk about uniqueness, Jared. Like how is it determined with a set?
Yeah. So in a set in JavaScript, I mean, when we're talking about primitive values, right? And primitive values, just well, there's a handful of them, but the primary ones in JavaScript, right, are string, number, Boolean. There's also symbol, and what are the other ones? I'm trying to remember here. I'm missing one of them. Uh,
Undefined. Um,
Undefined.
Undefined. We have big int,
Oh yeah,
and
and
I know there's seven, and I think we missed one. I think we missed one.
yeah, but with these primitive values, when we add them to a set, it's really easy to do a comparison check to say, hey, when we're trying to add another item, and to go through that whole set and to see if it exists or not, right? The comparison, and again, this is handled for us behind the scenes with the JavaScript set. It's really going to be simple to determine whether or not that item already exists or not.
So
With an
something important you mentioned there about the primitives is like primitives are not mutable, they're immutable. So once you set a value to a primitive, the value never changes. And don't confuse it with a variable, right? Because in a variable you can reassign it to a new primitive, right? So that makes it easy for that comparison, right, Jared? Because you just had the key, and that we're talking about values, really, right? It's really simple. So Jared, what happens when it comes to then the objects?
As far as I understand, when let's say you have a set of objects, if you go to add an object that is actually the same reference and it's already there, then it won't add it again. But if you add another object, even if that other object has all of the identical, same values on the inside, it will still add it because it's a different reference, and it's not going to be doing any sort of deep comparison check, as far as I'm aware.
Exactly. So sets, when it comes to objects, or arrays, which are also objects, when it comes to that, they are references. So remember, like in different podcasts, in previous podcast episodes, we talk about reference and value. So go check them out. I don't remember the episode number, but we spent a whole episode talking about that. So just check that so you understand the difference. But yeah, you're correct there, Jared. With when it comes to objects or arrays, it's just checking the reference, right? It's just checking, is this the same? Maybe let's say you create a constant and assign it to an array, and then you add that array to the set 5 times. It's going to say like, hey, this is the same reference because it has the same direction in memory, the same memory address. And this is handled for us under the hood. Like we don't really check for that. We don't manage memory addresses. There's no pointers in JavaScript. So it's really easy for us. So for example, if we call the set and we say, hey, okay, set.add, right? And we're going to talk about the methods, and we add the multiple variables that are assigned to different objects or arrays, it's just going to add each of the references once. But then if we have two arrays that we define, so it's just summarizing what Jared said, if we create two constants, for example, and we assign them to two objects, and the two objects have the same keys, let's say object name Jared, and the other is like the same name Jared, same keys, but it's two different constants that we created, it's two different references, right? So how do we know it's different references? You can just check a strict equality, like triple equal, for example, and compare the two objects, and it's going to return false.
Yeah.
So that's really simple. But Jared, this is when it gets interesting. So what happens about, like, for example, we have special objects in JavaScript. We have not a number, right? Not a number is just a representation of when something is not a number. So you know that not a number, when you do not a number equal 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 not a number, another number is used NaN. So if you're not familiar with it, anybody listening out there, our audience, is NaN. That means not a number. So if we have not a number equal not a number, we get false, even though it's the same global representation, the same global object is in the global scope, but the spec says that it's false. But when it comes to sets, something important here, Jared, is that it's going to be added just once. So that's also like something we get out of the box. If we're managing collections, it's really hard to check if the not a number is the same or it's already there or not. Like it just makes it hard because not a number is not equal to not a number. And it's just part of the spec. So that's really like very, very powerful there about sets. So
Yeah.
since I was mentioning not a number, Jared, like when does not a number come up like in JavaScript? Like when have you seen it in your personal experience like that? Something tells you not a number.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of specific instances. One instance is going to be when you try to take some sort of value, like let's say you have a string value and you attempt to cast it to a number, right? So one way to do this is there's a global function called number with a capital N. And then if you put the parentheses at the end to actually invoke it, or I guess technically a constructor, you can pass, if you pass in a string that is actually a number, it will then convert that to a value that is actually of type number. However, if you tried to type in, let's say, some letters, like a name, if I tried to put in Jared as a string into this constructor, then it is going to return this NaN value, this NaN value to say, hey, this is not a number.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe another instance is if you exceed the limit of the number range in JavaScript, this will also occur.
Okay, yeah, there's different instances, and those are common ones. I mean, I'm not sure about the long one. I haven't run into that, but if you ever run into that, use a big int, and that should solve it for you. But definitely the one with the string is the common case, right? Like doing operations like maybe a multiplied by 5, maybe, or maybe I think that returns not a number, or parsing, right? Parsing maybe number dot parsing, or using the number constructor, right? That you mentioned. There's other instances like, for example, getting the square root of -1. That's an imaginary number. So it's going to say just not a number. But yeah, not a number in a set is going to be unique. Real life, I don't think you would be setting not a number, right, into sets, but because the language is flexible and it has thought out about these cases, it supports that and says, you know what, it's just unique. Just one not a number for every set. So Jared, let's talk about like the operations for sets. Like why sets are easier. And let's talk about this. You're gonna tell me like one of the operations, and then I'm gonna say if I was doing this with an array. So we're gonna start comparing with an array, with a collection, array collection, and then we can see the benefits that sets offer out of the box, besides the uniqueness. So what would be the first function, the first built-in method that sets have out of the box?
Yeah, so once you've created your set by calling new set, and that's a capital S, and then parentheses to call the full constructor, the number one function you'll probably call is .add.
To the assign, so whatever that new set you assign to, right, in a variable or a constant, right, letter const, then yeah, .add. And .add, well, I mean, it's self-explanatory. What does it do, Jared?
So when you call .add, it's a function, so you have to use the parentheses, and you're going to pass the value in. And as its name implies, it's going to attempt to add it to the set.
Perfect.
And yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. And I like that you use the word attempt, because it doesn't mean it's just going to add it, right? So what it's going to do is going to say like, hey, if I don't have it, I'm going to add it to the set. The set is a collection. So that means like if you, for example, you print out the variable in your console at runtime, you're going to see the set and you're going to see the values inside. But that's perfect. So it adds, right? And if we compare with an array, let's say I have an array, the array in arrays, we use the dot push, right? But the difference is that array doesn't check for anything. So if we do in a set like dot add, and we call like my set dot add 1, and then again, call it again and call it again, it's just gonna have one value, which is the number 1, nothing else. But if I do that in an array with dot push, and I do my array dot push 1, and I run that 3 times, it's gonna have 1, 1, 1, 3 values, a size of 0, 1, 2. It's gonna have a length of 3, right?
And that's
So
going
yes,
to add it to the end of the array, right?
just
And
like the set is going to add it to the end. So that's similar there. But then the size of the set is just going to stay as 1. because it's going to be just unique. So that's kind of like we start seeing the differences. If I was to do that with a collection, like with an array, I would have to check, like maybe iterate through the array myself and maybe check like if the array dot includes the number I'm trying to add, then array dot push, and I have boilerplate code. Maybe I have 3-4 more lines of code every time I try to insert. And this is just the insertion. We haven't talked about removal or checking values, getting values, right? So it already starts becoming complicated if I need uniqueness and I'm using a collection. So that's when we start seeing the benefit of sets. So Jared, what would be the next function there for sets?
Yeah, so the next function is going to be .has. That's HAS. So again, on that set that we've assigned to a constant or a let, then we can call .has, which is a function, and pass a value in. And this is either going to return true or false to say whether or not the item in the collection exists, or I'm trying to recall here, or does it return the, yeah, I
No,
mean,
just return if true or false. You had it
yeah,
right. Yeah.
yeah.
Just true or false if it exists or not in the collection, in the set. That's perfect. If I was to do that with an array, I would have to do like my array dot includes and then pass the value, and that will return true or false if it is already there. So it's similar, but like most likely the hash in the set is gonna be more efficient as the collection is bigger, and if I have repeated values. And for performance, if you benchmark these, like using a set and using the dot includes, the set is gonna be faster because the set is gonna run these at the engine level. The dot includes could it tends to be slower. So if you need a lot of checks and things, that's when sets also come handy, as long as you know that the values will be unique. If you need repeated values, right, then use a collection. And in that case, you will have to use includes or for each or something else to iterate and find out if something is there, or maybe dot sum, right? There's different methods there. But that's perfect. So that's a second fundamental method. What would be the third one that we care about? I mean, we are adding, we're checking if there is existence, right? For existence of a value. So what would be the third one for the set?
The third one is going to be delete. So again, if we call .delete on our set and it's a function and we pass in the value, then it's going to attempt to delete the item from the set.
Perfect. And that's great. Attempt. I love that you use attempt, because if it is not there, it's not gonna error out. It's just gonna say like, okay, is deleted if it was there, right? So if you really need to know just was he there or not, maybe you want to do has first and then delete, right? But if you don't really care, like you're like, you just call delete. It's not gonna error out, which is really cool. With arrays, it's a little bit different, because with an array, I will have to maybe do some sort of splice to the leading place and muted the reference, right? Arrays arrays and sets, they are mutable by nature, right? So that will be fine using an splice, muted in place, but then I have to figure out the index first. So maybe I would have to do like maybe do the includes, or maybe find index, right? To find the index, or index of maybe, or something like that, and then find the index, then do a splice, then delete the value, and then with the splice. But that's kind of like such a pain. It's kind of like already 4 operations there. With the set, it's just as simple as dot delete. It's already a big advantage there. And perfect. So we are deleting, we're checking if the value is there or not, but we're not getting the value right there. So I think we have all the operations. There's one more. Let's say we want to empty the set. Let's say I'm done using it, but I just need to reuse it for my next cycle or something. How do we empty the existing set?
I can't say know that one off the top of my head, other than reinitializing a new set. But what is it, Juan?
If we're to reuse it, let's say we have a service or a class or something that has already a setting, we want to empty it, we just call dot clear. So it's as simple as my set dot clear, and the parentheses, because it's a function that's gonna empty the set, but it's gonna keep the existing reference I already have. So I don't have to create a new one. If you create a new one, that's also fine. Let's say you have a pure function. We have talked about pure functions before. Check out those episodes. But yeah, if you have a pure function, reassigning a new one, that's fine, right? But you can always empty it if you want to reuse the existing. But when it comes to arrays, it's do you know how to empty an existing reference of an array, Jared? This one is a tricky one that comes up a lot in interviews.
I feel like I've seen it before, but I can't recall it right now.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. So when it comes to arrays, you would do my array dot, let's say my array is the variable I have, dot length equals 0. So by changing the property, the length property, instead of using it as a getter, you use it as a setter to 0. That's going to keep the existing reference. So instead of reassigning, let's say I have it as a constant, I'm just going to empty it. And that's going to be more efficient instead of creating new arrays. So that's like good things, interview tips, how to empty an array. Take note of that. Just assign the length. So
Yeah.
Jared, what were you going to
Yeah,
add?
I was gonna ask. So, with arrays, we're able to iterate over them quite easily with the for of functionality. Can we do that same thing with a set?
Yes, we have. We can do that. So set, besides these functions, there's other functions that are built in and some properties. So for example, one property that I forgot to mention, the dot size, like array dot length, right? Dot size, but you don't reassign the size to 0. That doesn't work with sets. But like dot size is a getter that will return the size of the set, how many elements you have in the set, right? And to iterate, we have different functions that are built in. So we have dot keys, we have dot values, we have dot entries, and these are iterable functions. They return iterable, which means that you can put in a for loop. And for example, you can use about the keys because the sets don't have really keys and values. It's just keys. Dot keys and dot values return the same in a set, so you can use either. And then the dot entries returns an array with the values, like an array of key values. It's kind of like an array of arrays. I don't remember exactly what it returns, but when you iterate it, you can do dot entries, and then you will get an array for each attribute, for each item, and that array contains the values, if I remember well. But yes, definitely we can use those functions. We can convert a set to an array also. You can use array.from, and then you pass the set, and that's going to return an array. That's one easy way to do that. There's no like built-in function to say like to array. There's no built-in function for that, but you can use array.from and then pass the set, and it's going to turn it into an array. Sometimes if you need that, sometimes it's very useful, and it's going to be the array of unique items. But yeah, I think that covers us for sets, Jared, unless you have anything
Yeah, I
extra
think
to
just the
add.
last little tip is that it is possible to take an array that may have duplicate items and very easily turn it into a set that will automatically remove those duplicate items. So that's
Mhm.
a quick little tip for you.
Yeah. So how would be that one? Like, how would you do it, Jared? Let's say I have an array called my array, and I have a lot of repeated numbers. How would I get the unique values of that using a set?
I can't remember the exact syntax. You're gonna have to remind me of that one,
Oh
Juan.
yeah. Okay. So it's simple. All we have to do is that you do like, let's say, const my set equal new set parentheses, and to that parentheses you pass the array, and then automatically that is gonna initialize it with those values, but it's gonna remove their duplicates. It's gonna be unique, and then you could do array from, and then pass that array that you just created, that set that you just created, and you're gonna get an array without duplicates. That's super easy. Instead of having to like create multiple arrays, iterate through them, try to remove duplicates. That's an easy shortcut. And there's other ways, and you can leverage sets for that. There's other ways to do it. You can do it without sets, but that's like very, very convenient there. But yeah, that also sometimes comes in interviews like, hey, you need to use, they use unique values. So think of sets. Sets will make your life easier. You can do it with arrays, but you're going to have a harder time and waste time at the interview because you will have to like struggle and figure all these things out, right? So perfect. So okay, so a little break here. Don't forget to follow us on whatever platform you're listening this on or watching this on. Subscribe, follow, so you're notified about new podcast episodes. We try to publish weekly. Last week we skipped one, but usually it's weekly. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter. So we'll have links on the description, and you can find us on Twitter. And then follow us and interact with us. And yeah, we're there for you.
Yep.
So,
We'll see you
Jared, let's
there.
talk about maps. So, you might be wondering, oh, we spend a lot of time in sets, and now we're going to run out of time. But the thing is, like, maps also share a lot of common ground with sets. With like, so I'm just going to start there to make it simple. So then we don't have to like address it. But like maps, right? We have also like the size property. We also have the dot entries, dot keys. Keys returns the keys of the map. Values returns the values. Maps, like for example, if you have an object, right? If you have an object and you want to get iterate through the object like a normal plain object, it's kind of annoying because you have to do like object.keys and pass the object and then for each, right? With a map, you don't have to do that. You just do dot entries, for example, or dot keys or dot values. It's really easy. So let's define what is a map, right? In JavaScript, Jared.
Yeah, definitely. So a map is an object in JavaScript that's used to hold things or store things, similar to like a sets or an array. But a map is most similar to a plain JavaScript object. And we're going to be talking about the ways that they are different, or how a map is more efficient than a plain object. But the idea is how we store things inside of it is there's going to be some sort of key, and that key then corresponds to some value. And a big part of maps is the ability to look up the values from the keys pretty much instantaneously. One little example, just to kind of set the tone here, is imagine you have a list of like 10,000 students and you want to store them in an efficient way. Well, one way you could do that is you could store as their key the student number or the student ID. And then as the value, you could have the object of the student, and all the information is like what courses they're enrolled in, courses they've completed, grades, and things like that. But Juan, let's talk about some use cases and get
Yeah.
into some of the details here.
Yeah, so yeah, you said it perfect. One thing I would add, the keys are the ones that would be unique. So kind of like use the sets, same rules, right? So not a number, and everything we said about sets, the uniqueness applies to the keys of the map. And use map is the key value pair, really. Like just like as when you use plain objects and you have keys and values, same thing. So that's just to summarize it. Real life situations when you would need that for fast lookups, what you mentioned. Let's say I need to find the users really fast and I have already built out a map. You can use an object for that, or you can use a native map. But the thing is that with the object, it could be more messy to work with. For example, you want to iterate through, let's say I tell you, okay, print out all the students, right? You have to do object.keys, right? And then dot for each, and then maybe start using like the current. It's just like more messy. With a map, you just do the dot entries, and then you get the key value, or you can do dot keys or dot values. Built-in methods with the map, right? We have the has, the set. Instead of add, like in the set, we don't use add, we use dot set, and we pass a key, comma, and a value. So that's kind of like that there. For examples, yeah, use fast lookups when you want O1. So when you want instant lookups with O1 complexity or constant complexity. And if you don't know about that, maybe we'll do an episode on that in the future. But O1, constant complexity, constant runtime, right? It will give you the instant value based on the keys. But one of the disadvantages of maps or hash objects or plain object literals is that you need to know the key beforehand. So let's say with a collection, with an array, or with a set, you can just iterate through it, right? And be like, oh yeah, I just can, by index, give me the item number 5 in an array, right? You can get it. But the problem is that with maps, if you don't know the key beforehand, you cannot just say like, hey, get me the value. Like, for example, use the dot get method to get, like, say dot get and pass the key, like the ID number 5 for the student 5. Then if you don't know that you're looking for the 5, then it's kind of useless unless you want to iterate through all of it and print it out. But then maybe map is not the right thing to use there. Reasons, like Jared, reasons to use a native map versus a plain object. What would be a good reason to use the native one?
Yeah, there's a few different reasons. One of them is that with a map, everything that you add to it has to be explicitly added to it. Whereas with an object, a plain JavaScript object, you may or may not, depending on the circumstances, that object may or may not have certain prototype values that are already pre-existing on it. Where with a map, you're guaranteed that it's going to be clean and ready for you to be able to interact with it.
Yeah, and that's because the object prototype, right? They have properties that are set, and they have methods. And then when you start looping through an object, like maybe you have seen that sometimes you want to use has on property if you're using older JavaScript styles, right? When you do maybe a for in, then it's kind of like it gets messy. But yeah, definitely it has some baggage. Other reason really is like the built-in methods. I want to iterate through them instead of using object.keys and then the messy syntax that is ugly and hard to read. You just do the dot entries or dot keys or dot values, right? You can clear it. You can use dot clear and it's empty. With an object, you have to use maybe delete, but delete is not as efficient. So maybe you don't want to be deleting a lot of keys. So, maybe it's easier to use reassign the variable and then let garbage collection clear out from memory that. But yeah, it has those benefits, the built-in methods and the and
Yeah, I want to talk about a couple of those and how they're
mhm.
a little bit different than with set. So with a map, we talked about how in order to add an item, we used the add function
For the
to say
set,
that.
yeah.
However, there's no add when it comes to map. They distinctly use a different name, which is called set. And they use set because the idea here is whether if it's empty, it's going to set it, which will add it effectively. But if it's already there and we're trying to set a different value, it will simply just override that existing value, right? So that's an important distinction from there.
Let
But
me
many
give
of the
an
other
example.
methods, go ahead.
Let me give an example on that one so it's clear to our audience. So for example, I have my students, const students equal new map, open and close parentheses. I have my map, and then I say map my students dot set open parentheses, and let's say the key is gonna be my student ID number one, comma, and then the whole object that says name Juan, age, everything, and then we do that again. We call it again with the same number, like the same ID. Let's say number one is the number, right? Like the ID, and then we pass a separate object. Let's say we replace it with the Jared user, the Jared object. Then it's gonna replace that one completely. So I lost what I had before because I used the same key because the keys are unique and you are effectively replacing it. So that would be a good example. Best recommendation, remember, you have homework with us. Go Google Sets, Maps, do examples, do exercises, look at the code. We're just exposing you to the topics here. So then you go and practice and you become a better engineer.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was a great example you gave there, Juan. And for that reason, you as the engineer who's creating this have the responsibility to ensure that if you are adding something new, that it is unique, that the key is unique. Otherwise, you're going to be overwriting some pre-existing data.
And
But the other functions are actually align with the set, as in we have a dot has, which again is going to return a Boolean true or false, whether or not that the item
the
with
key.
that key exists. Yep.
Mhm.
And then there's also a delete, and there's also a get, and the get is different than the has, in that get will return the value that corresponds with that key. And if
Mhm.
it can't find it, it's going to return undefined. Just like in most things in JavaScript, when it attempts to find something and it's not there, it's going to return undefined.
So they don't get, yeah. And if you want safety, a common case, you would do something like, let's say, students dot has number one. Let's say I'm looking for me, my number ID, right? And if you have it, then you say students dot get, and that would be like the safer way. You wrap it with an if, and you check for has. And yeah, it's an extra operation, but it's safer because if you just do dot get and you think I'm getting the student, you might be setting it to undefined, and then you could have exceptions and errors down the road. So be careful when you use that. But yeah, perfect there, Jared. Like the fact that you mentioned that the dot get, you pass the key, let's say number one, and returns the value if it is there. Sets don't have that because in sets it's just like we just care if it is there or not because we just have keys. We don't have values, right? So
Yeah.
so we know that it's there or it's not there. We don't care. We don't have a pair, key value pair.
Yeah.
So Jared, for example, like tricky questions, um, you know, um, when it comes to keys, right, or sets, when we're setting the values or the keys of the set, right, when we pass like -0 or +0 and 0, let's say I have a map, right, and I'm doing like dot set and I pass the key as 0 and I add some value there, then I call again dot add, and then I do -0 and then I pass a value. Do you think they're gonna be different, or do you think I'm overriding it? Let's say I call it with 0, -0, and +0 three times. So I'm expecting maybe I have three items or not. What is going to happen there? What do you think is going to happen there? Am I going to have three, or did I just set one and I overrode it?
I believe that you're just going to overwrite it because it's going to handle those. I mean, whether or not they're positive or negative, or there's no sign in front of it, it's going to be treating those the same.
Perfect. And yeah, that's true. So what happens is starting in ES 2015 or ES 6, they address, like before it used to address it different. There was no native maps, but it used to address these cases different, where 0 + 0 and -0 were treated as different values. But now, like starting 2015 and everything, is the same. So it uses the same zero, same value zero, same zero value algorithm. And all it says is that, you know what, zero plus zero minus zero is the same thing. So that means like if you were using as a key that, it would be, you would be just overriding and it would be just zero.
Yeah.
Something important, Jared, like for keys, when it comes to maps, make sure it's unique. So for example, H is not a good key because then you can override it, right? Or let's say you're using names. Names is not a good key, right? So make sure you're using maybe IDs that come from the API, from the database. If you're using ages, then the value you could set it as an array, and then when there's collisions, you could add to it, right? But those are special cases, like kind of like when we talk about hashes and collisions and stuff like that. But I'm not gonna get there. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think really, yeah, we're out of time, Jared. So yeah, anything you want to add to finalize?
Just really quickly, a couple of the other distinctions between a plain JavaScript object and a map. One of them is that with a map, you can use pretty much anything as a key to correspond to the value, where in plain JavaScript objects, you can only use a string or a symbol. And then the last point, or the couple last points, is that from a performance standpoint, and Juan Canano had mentioned this earlier, if you're frequently adding and removing from a map, then it's going to be better to use a map than an object, because the deletion of keys from an object is more expensive. And then the last point is the size. When we have this map object, you get that size variable built in. Whereas if you're using a plain JavaScript object, you would have to use object.keys.length in order
You have
to
to
get the
count.
size of it.
And that's inefficient because object.keys is gonna like iterate through it to get the keys and then the length, right? Because it returns an array, so it's gonna return you that, but it's more operation. So definitely the map keep tracks of that size, and as you add and remove items, it adds the size. So the size is not calculated when you read it. It's not gonna say like, okay, I'm gonna count the 10,000 students. No, it's already stored with the latest value depending on the operation. So it's very smart, but perfect. So yeah, I think this was a great topic. We're gonna maybe tweet about it, like some tips and things this week. Maybe we should, Jared, so we can share, like little tips and things since they're so relevant. And that's really it. So thank you so much for joining us in this episode of Dev Bootcamp Live. I'm Juan Lizarazo,
And I'm Jared Potter.
and we'll see you next week.
Take care.